Somewhere in northern Eurasia, about 20,000 years ago, a person stood over a pile of meat they couldn't eat and looked out into the dark, where something was sitting in the snow, watching them. That something hunted what they hunted, the way they hunted it, in groups, patiently, and it occasionally ate people. 800 generations later, its direct descendant is asleep upside down in a memory foam bed shaped like a croissant, and its name is Biscuit. So what happened in between? And not when did that animal become useful to us? When did it become loved? Those are potentially very different dates, and only one of them is easy to dig up. Back to that winter for a second, because the details matter later. It's a reindeer carcass, and you've already taken what you actually need. The marrow, the brain, the fat packed around the organs, the greasy parts that keep a human being upright when there hasn't been a plant worth eating for 4 months. What's left on the ground in front of you is a mountain of lean red meat that will, if you eat too much of it, kill you. 20 feet back, past where the firelight gives up, the thing in the snow has been sitting there a while, holding its distance, in no apparent hurry to leave. Think about what a dog actually is. It's a carnivore with a bite that can split bone, descended from an animal that takes down prey 10 times its weight, and it is currently lying upside down on your sofa with its legs in the air, producing an outraged noise about a delivery driver who is 2 houses away and leaving. Somewhere between those two facts, something enormous happened to both species. And the deeper you dig into when it happened, the more the standard story falls apart. Starting with whether the animal at the edge of your fire was even a wolf in the way you're picturing. You already know the version everybody gets taught. Some clever ancestor grabs a litter of wolf cubs, raises them by hand, and they grow up loyal. Repeat a few times, breed the best ones, and eventually you've got a guard, a hunting partner, and a small industry in tennis balls. Humans domesticated wolves. Deliberately. A project with a goal. It's a completely reasonable thing to believe. It's in most documentaries. It's the version in the textbook, and it matches how we tell every other domestication story. Humans decide, animals comply. The problem isn't that it's stupid. The problem is that the evidence keeps refusing to sit inside it. Take the wolf itself. In 2022, a team led by the Francis Crick Institute in London sequenced 72 ancient wolf genomes spanning the last 100,000 years, pulled from Europe, Siberia, and North America, including a wolf head out of Siberian permafrost that has been dead for 32,000 years and still has its fur and its teeth. When they lined dogs up against that time series, dogs came out closest to ancient wolves from eastern Eurasia, with a second, more westerly wolf source showing up in some dog populations and not others. What they did not find, anywhere in the entire dataset, was the actual ancestor. That population appears to be gone. Every grey wolf alive today is your dog's cousin rather than its grandparent. A surviving branch of a family whose founding member we have never dug up. Then there's what happens when people try the shortcut. Wolf pups have been hand-raised, repeatedly, in research settings, bottle-fed from days old with round-the-clock human contact. What you get is an animal that knows you, tolerates you, and is manageable in roughly the way a forklift is manageable. What you do not get is a dog. Taming happens to an individual animal and dies with it. Domestication happens to a lineage, across generations in the genome. Mixing up those two is the single most common mistake in this entire subject, and it's the reason people keep buying wolf hybrids and then quietly rehoming their sofa. And the timing is the part that should stop the story cold. Whatever was happening between us and these animals was already well underway during the Ice Age, before agriculture, before pottery, before villages, before anyone anywhere had domesticated a single other species. There was no template. Nobody had ever tamed a goat and thought, right, let's try that on the predator. The dog is the first, the only one pulled off by hunter-gatherers who were still moving, and it happened with nothing to copy. So the pieces don't fit a plan, which leaves the question of what people actually felt about these animals while it was going on. And that's where most coverage stops, because feelings don't fossilize. Except that once they did, and the evidence sat in a museum for 100 years before anyone read it properly. That's the bind archaeologists are stuck with. A bone tells you an animal existed near people. It doesn't tell you what anyone thought about it. A dog buried in a grave is suggestive, sure, but you can always argue it was a possession, a status object, or lunch that got interrupted. To prove affection, you'd need something else entirely. An animal that could give a human being absolutely nothing and got looked after anyway. In 1914, quarry workers near Bonn, in Germany, hit a grave. Inside were a man of about 40, a woman in her mid-20s, carved objects of antler and bone and teeth, a scattering of red ochre, and a dog. The whole thing dates to a little over 14,200 years ago, before farming, before the last ice sheets had finished retreating off northern Europe, roughly 9,000 years before anyone stacked the first stone at Stonehenge. For most of the next century, that dog was a footnote. Earliest confirmed domestic dog burial. Tick the box. Move on. Then a Dutch veterinarian named Luc Janssens, doing his doctorate at Leiden, went back and looked at its teeth. Teeth keep a record. When a young animal is severely ill, enamel formation stutters and leaves a horizontal line, permanently, at whatever developmental stage the body had reached. The Bonn puppy had a line at 19 weeks, then another at 21, then another at 23. The pattern, along with lesions in the mouth and severe gum disease pointing to a wrecked immune system, matched canine distemper, a morbillivirus that runs through the lungs, the gut, and then the nervous system, bringing fever, vomiting, diarrhea, seizures, and a total collapse of the animal's ability to keep itself warm or fed. 3 separate bouts of it. And here's what Janssens pointed out. A dog that's sick without care is dead in under 3 weeks. This one lived for weeks beyond that, twice over. Somebody kept a seizing, incontinent, freezing puppy warm through an ice age winter. Somebody carried water to it. Somebody cleaned it, over and over, for more than a month, while it could not hunt, could not guard, could not carry, could not do one single thing for the people keeping it alive. It died at around 7 months old. They put it in the ground with 2 of their own, and they put a tooth from a second older dog in there with it. 14,000 years ago, someone nursed a dying puppy that was no use to anybody. That's one grave, though, and one grave is an anecdote. It could be a strange family, a one-off, sentiment that never spread. What turns it into evidence is whether the same gesture shows up somewhere with no possible connection to the Rhine Valley. Different climate, different people, different world. It does. In 1978, Simon Davis and François Valla published a short paper in Nature on canid remains from Natufian sites in northern Israel. At Ain Malaha, a village of round semi-sunken houses beside what was then Lake Hula, they found an adult woman laid on her side, knees drawn up, her hand resting on the chest of a puppy 3 to 5 months old. 12,000 years ago. At Hayanim Terrace, a man had gone into the ground with 2 small dogs, roughly 1,000 years earlier than that. This is 2,000 miles from Bonn, in a landscape with no ice in sight, oak and pistachio, wild wheat, people living year-round in stone-walled houses, and grinding grain with stone mortars. Everything about their lives was different. The gesture is identical. You can argue about a lot of things in archaeology. Hand placement is not really one of them. And you already know that gesture, because you do it without deciding to. Your hand ends up on the dog. You're watching something else entirely, thinking about something else entirely, and your hand is on the dog. Affection explains why the relationship stuck around. It doesn't explain how it started, and that's the genuinely hard part. Wolves and humans were direct competitors. Same prey, same hunting strategy, same territory, both fully capable of killing the other. Competing predators don't normally merge. They normally take turns eliminating each other. The best answer going right now is beautifully unromantic. In 2021, Maria Latinen, a researcher with the Finnish Food Authority, published a hypothesis with colleagues in scientific reports built on a limitation in your own body. We're primates, and our livers can only process so much protein. Past roughly 45% of your calories, you're into protein poisoning, sometimes called rabbit starvation, which is fatal in weeks. We need fat or carbohydrate alongside the meat. Wolves don't. A wolf can run on nothing but lean meat for months and be completely fine about it. Now put that into a late Pleistocene winter. Plants are gone. The animals you're hunting, horse, reindeer, moose, have burned through their own fat reserves. So a single carcass gives you very little of the thing you desperately need, and a huge amount of the thing that will poison you. To get enough fat, you have to kill more animals than you can possibly eat. The team ran the numbers across 28 potential prey species at Ice Age sites, and in all but one case, a successful hunt left behind more protein than the hunters could safely consume. They also noticed that every Pleistocene site with early dog or proto-dog remains sits in a subarctic or Arctic analog environment, which means the surplus you're standing over is precisely exactly the thing you can't use, and the animal watching you can. The greatest interspecies friendship in the history of the planet may well have begun with our ancestors not being able to finish dinner. It's a hypothesis, and people argue about it. Some archaeologists point out that hunter-gatherers dry and store surplus rather than tossing it around. But it solves the problem no other explanation touches. It turns a competitor into a partner, without anyone having to be brave or clever. Leftovers get you proximity, though. They don't get you a dog. What gets you a dog is which wolves came for them. Not the boldest. The bold ones lunge and get a spear. Not the most fearful either. They starve at a distance. The ones that ate were the ones that could hold their nerve at 20 feet from a human being and do absolutely nothing about it. That's a filter on temperament. And a filter applied to a population, generation after generation, has a name. Selection. Nobody has to intend it. What that looks like when you run it on purpose is one of the strangest experiments of the 20th century. In 1959, at the Institute of Cytology and Genetics in Novosibirsk, Dmitry Belyaev started breeding silver foxes on a single criterion, and Lyudmila Trut kept it running for decades after him. The criterion wasn't appearance, and it wasn't intelligence. It was one question. Does this animal approach a human hand without fleeing or biting? That's the whole test. Within about 10 generations, the foxes started coming out with floppy ears, curly tails, white patches on the coat, shorter snouts, faces that stayed juvenile-looking into adulthood. They whined for attention, licked hands, and wagged when a person walked into the room, none of which was on the checklist. Nobody selected for a curly tail. It arrived on its own, because the developmental machinery that governs fear and stress response is tangled up with the machinery that builds cartilage and pigment and skull shape. Pull hard on temperament, and the anatomy comes along behind it, uninvited. The experiment has its critics. Those foxes came from fur farms and were already generations removed from truly wild animals, which complicates the clean version of the story. But the central observation has held. The entire look we read as domestic can be a side effect of nothing more than tolerating people, which is another way of saying that the floppy ears on your dog are the packaging that came free with the personality. If a filter like that runs on wolves for thousands of years, you'd eventually expect something specific to show up. Equipment aimed at humans, and only at humans, which is where the anatomy gets almost uncomfortable. In 2019, Julian Kaminsky, at the University of Portsmouth, published dissections of dog and wolf heads in Penas. The facial muscles matched almost everywhere. One region didn't. Dogs have a small muscle called the levator anguli oculi medialis. It lifts the inner eyebrow, that upward tilt that makes the eyes look bigger and rounder, and the whole face look young and slightly heartbroken. In the gray wolves, that muscle was barely there. A few scattered fibers in connective tissue. In every dog, dissected but one, it was well developed and unmistakable. Watch the behavior, and the same split shows up. Put a human in front of them, and dogs throw the eyebrow far more often and far harder, with the highest intensity version produced by dogs alone. The expression lands close to what a human face does when a human is sad. It trips the circuit in us that responds to infants. And in earlier work, Kaminsky found that shelter dogs who did it more got adopted faster. So, your dog has a dedicated muscle for making you feel terrible, and you are the reason it exists. Although, and this is the kind of complication that makes the field worth following, dissections since then have found the same muscle in coyotes, well developed, which suggests it may be an old canid trait that grey wolves lost, rather than one dog's invented. That doesn't undo anything. It just quietly repeats the point from earlier. When we compare a dog to a grey wolf, we're comparing it to a cousin who took a different road, and the road we actually want to look at is the one nobody has dug up yet. The face is half of it. The other half is what that face does to your bloodstream. A team at Azabu University in Japan ran an experiment in 2015 with a design that reads, on paper, like 30 people being asked to hang out with their dogs. 30 pairs, 1 room, 30 minutes, talk to it and pet it if you feel like it. Urine samples before and after. What they were measuring was oxytocin, the hormone that runs bonding between a mother and a newborn. In the pairs that spent the most time in mutual eye contact, oxytocin climbed about 130% in the dogs and around 300% in the owners. In pairs that barely looked at each other, nothing moved. They also ran hand-raised wolves with the humans who had raised them. The wolves wouldn't hold the gaze, and nobody's levels budged. Then they sprayed oxytocin up the dogs' noses, and the dogs gazed more, and the owner's levels rose again, a loop feeding itself, in 2 species that are not remotely related and don't reproduce together. An animal found its way into the circuitry our species uses for its own children. It got in through eye contact. None of which means dogs were only ever pets, and that assumption is worth killing before it hardens, because the split we make, working animal over here, family member over there, is a modern one and a fairly silly one. 500 kilometers north of the Siberian mainland sits Zhukov Island, where Vladimir Petulko has been excavating since 1989. 9,000 years ago, it wasn't an island, and the people living there hunted polar bears without firearms, which is a sentence worth reading twice. Among the reindeer and bear bones, he found wooden sled parts, probable harness gear, and the remains of at least 11 dogs. 10 of them weighed between 16 and 25 kilos. Almost exactly modern Siberian husky build, which is the size range that can pull hard without overheating. The 11th came in around 29 kilos and looks like a wolf-dog hybrid. 2 distinct clusters, not a random spread. Someone was shaping these animals on purpose. The smaller ones for sledding, the big one, most likely, for going after bears. It's the earliest evidence of dog breeding anywhere in the archaeological record, and the genome of a 9,500-year-old dog from that site still runs through Greenland sled dogs today. Those dogs worked. They also, presumably, slept next to the people they worked for, in a tent, in the Arctic, because that is what happens with dogs. The Bonn puppy offered nothing at all, and got a month of nursing and a place in a grave. Both of those are true. In the same species, in the same era. So, did early humans have dogs as pets? Yes. Long before farming, long before writing, long before anything you'd call a settlement, someone was doing a version of what you do. And the specific thing is this. Sometime in the next few days, you'll be standing at the sink scraping a plate. The fat you didn't want, the bit of chicken skin, the ends of something. And the dog will appear and sit down. Then it'll do the odd part. It'll stop looking at the plate and look at your face instead. Hold your eyes. Wait. When you look back, both of you get a chemical response you didn't authorize and can't switch off. Yours is the stronger one, for what it's worth. Then you'll almost certainly say something to it out loud, in a voice about an octave above the one you use with adult humans, asking a question you know full well isn't going to be answered. Nobody taught you that voice. You didn't decide to have it. 20,000 years ago, somebody stood over more meat than a human liver can survive, in a winter with no plants in it, and made eye contact with an animal that had been waiting out there in the snow at the edge of the light for hours. Nobody wrote it down. Nobody had a word for what was starting. There was just a surplus of the exact thing they couldn't eat, and it could, and a very long time in which to keep noticing each other. The plate at the sink is the same event. It never actually stopped. So next time it happens, hold the eye contact a couple of seconds longer than you normally would. And while you're down there, have a look around the kitchen. If somebody excavated your home 14,000 years from now and found the bowl, the bed, the small coat, the position of the bones, what do you reckon they'd conclude about which of you was in charge?